Ever wonder what people ate at fancy dinners 800 years ago? Could you stomach a pie filled with live birds? What if your dessert was designed to bleed when you cut into it? Number 5. Cockantress. Half-rooster, half-pig monster. Did medieval nobles really eat mythical creatures? Well, sort of. The cockentrice was perhaps one of the most bizarre creations to grace a medieval banquet table. Imagine the front half of a roasted pig sewn to the bottom half of a rooster, or sometimes the other way around. This culinary monstrosity wasn't the result of some weird medieval genetic experiment. It was entirely the creation of skilled and imaginative cooks looking to impress their lords and ladies. Creating this show-stopping centerpiece was no simple task. Medieval cooks would carefully select a plump pig and a sizable rooster. After partially cooking both animals, they would perform what amounted to culinary surgery, cutting each animal in half and stitching the mismatched parts together with thread and needles. The resulting chimera would then be returned to the oven to finish cooking, often basted with exotic spices and glazes containing saffron, ginger, and wine. The Cockantress wasn't just about shock value, although that was certainly part of its appeal. Medieval feasts were theatrical experiences where food served as entertainment as much as nourishment. The nobility delighted in presenting their guests with fantastical dishes that demonstrated both their wealth and their connection to the mystical world. The Cockantress, resembling the griffins and other hybrid beasts from medieval bestiaries and legends, brought these mythical creatures to life in edible form. Cooking manuscripts from the 15th century, including the Form of Curie compiled by King Richard II's master cooks, contain detailed instructions for creating these hybrid roasts. They were particularly popular at Christmas feasts and other major celebrations where hosts wanted to outdo their previous entertainments. While modern diners might recoil at the thought of such a bizarre creation, medieval feasters viewed it quite differently. The cockentrice represented the height of culinary craftsmanship and imagination. It wasn't seen as grotesque, but rather as a magnificent display of the cook's skill and the host's generosity. After all, to create such an elaborate dish required sacrificing not one but two valuable animals, something only the wealthiest homes could afford. Despite its strange appearance, the cockentrice was entirely edible, and probably quite delicious by medieval standards. The combination of tender pork and flavorful rooster meat, seasoned with expensive imported spices, would have provided a memorable taste experience for lucky guests. Number 4. 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. Remember that nursery rhyme about birds in a pie? It wasn't just a children's story. One of the most theatrical dishes served at medieval banquets was the entremets, or subtlety, that involved live birds enclosed in a pie crust. Yes, you read that correctly. Live bird. When the pie was cut open at the table, the birds would fly out, causing equal parts delight and chaos among the dinner guests. The practice dates back to at least the 14th century and reached its peak during the 16th century. Accounts from royal feasts describe enormous pies being presented with great ceremony. When the top crust was removed, dozens of birds, typically small songbirds like blackbirds, sparrows, or even colorful finches, would suddenly emerge and fly around the banquet hall. The surprise and spectacle were considered worth every bit of the considerable effort required to create such an elaborate trick. Creating this peculiar pie required significant engineering skills. Cooks would construct a large, hollow pie crust with a sturdy bottom and sides. The top crust would be baked separately and designed to be easily removed. Just before serving, small birds would be carefully placed inside the pre-baked shell, and the top would be loosely set in place. The entire construction would then be ceremoniously carried to the banquet table. In some particularly elaborate versions of this dish, the pie might contain different elements in separate compartments. Historical records describe pies that, when opened, released not only birds but also frogs or rabbits. One particularly famous example was presented at a feast for King Charles I of England, where different compartments in a single massive pie contained birds, rabbits, and a dwarf who jumped out wielding a tiny sword. While the birds were never intended to be eaten as part of this particular dish, the pie crust itself was often edible and would be consumed after the avian occupants had made their dramatic exit, more commonly once the birds had been released, and likely caused a significant commotion in the dining hall. Servants would bring in the actual meat pie that was intended for consumption. This tradition eventually made its way into the famous nursery rhyme, "Sing a song of sixpence," with its 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. While children today might imagine this as a gruesome fate for the birds, medieval diners would have recognized it as a reference to this spectacular form of dinner entertainment. The live bird pie exemplified the medieval and early Renaissance approach to dining as theater. Food wasn't just sustenance, or even merely a display of wealth through exotic ingredients. It was an opportunity for surprise, delight, and memorable entertainment. The emotional reaction of guests was considered as important as the flavors on their plates. Number 3. Hedgehog Pudding. A prickly dessert illusion. Would you eat something that looked like it might still be alive? Medieval diners. Hedgehog pudding, or wycounds as it was called in Middle English, was not actually made from real hedgehogs, but was a clever culinary illusion designed to look exactly like one. This whimsical dish combined the medieval love of meat, sweets, and visual trickery into one memorable creation. The dish typically consisted of spiced pork mixed with currants, dates, and other dried fruits, formed into the shape of a hedgehog. The spines were created by inserting slivered almonds or sometimes pine nuts all over the surface of the meatloaf-like creation. These nuts would be arranged in neat rows to mimic the appearance of hedgehog quills. The finished creation would then be roasted until golden brown, with the almond spines becoming toasted and fragrant. To complete the illusion, many recipes called for adding small pieces of fruit to represent the creature's face, perhaps raisins for eyes, and a slice of apple for a snout. Some particularly elaborate versions even included little legs fashioned from pastry. The overall effect was a surprisingly realistic-looking hedgehog sitting proudly on a serving platter. The 14th century cookbook, The Form of Curry, compiled by the master cooks of King Richard II around 1390, contains one of the earliest recipes for this unusual creation. The instructions direct cooks to take pig and seethe boil him well, and take the flesh and he chop it small, and grind it full well, and mix it with raw yolks of iron eggs, and with cloves, maces, piner, and sugar. After shaping this mixture and adding the almond spines, the cook was instructed to bake him as thou wold bake a pig, and serve him forth. What made hedgehog pudding particularly interesting was its position between savory and sweet, a combination that was much more common in medieval cuisine than in modern Western cooking. The mixture of spiced meat with fruits and sugar created a complex flavor profile that medieval diners particularly enjoyed. This blending of flavors that modern eaters might consider incompatible was typical of high-status medieval cooking, which often sought to demonstrate sophistication through unexpected combinations. The hedgehog shape wasn't just chosen at random. Medieval people had a fascination with the natural world and often incorporated animal forms into their cooking. Additionally, the hedgehog had symbolic associations in medieval culture. It was believed to roll in fallen fruit to collect it on its spines, symbolizing gathering and abundance. Some Christian symbolism even associated the hedgehog with the resurrection, as it was thought to hibernate, appearing dead, before coming back to life in spring. Serving such an elaborate creation demonstrated both the skill of the household's cooks and the wealth of the host who could afford the expensive ingredients, like sugar, imported spices, and almonds. It also coquetted the medieval love of subtleties, dishes designed to surprise and delight guests not just with their taste, but also with their appearance. Number 2. Lampres in blood sauce. The dish that killed a king. How deadly can dinner be? Would you eat the very thing that killed a monarch? Among the strangest delicacies served at medieval feasts, lampres hold a particularly notorious place in culinary history. These eel-like parasitic fish with circular, tooth-lined sucker mouths were considered the height of luxury, despite their disturbing appearance. But their greatest claim to fame comes from one particularly famous incident. They allegedly caused the death of King Henry I of England in 1135. According to chroniclers of the time, Henry I was so fond of lampres that he continued to eat them, despite his physician's warnings. After overindulging in his favorite lamprey dish while staying in Normandy, the king fell violently ill and died shortly afterward. Whether the lampres were actually toxic or simply too rich for his aging digestive system remains debated by historians, but the association between lampres and royal demise was firmly established in medieval lore. Despite, or perhaps because of this notorious incident, lampres remained a prestigious food throughout the medieval period and well into the Renaissance. They were particularly associated with royal tables and were often presented as gifts to monarchs. The city of Gloucester had a tradition of presenting a lamprey pie to the monarch at Christmas, a custom that continued for centuries, though it became increasingly ceremonial rather than culinary as lamprey populations declined. What made lampres particularly strange by modern standards was the way they were prepared. After being caught in rivers during their spawning season, lampreys would be killed by having a cork hammered into their sucker mouths, a particularly gruesome method necessitated by their slippery eel-like bodies. They would then be cooked in their own blood, which was carefully collected during the killing process and used as the base for a thick sauce. A typical medieval lamprey recipe called for the fish to be cleaned, its blood preserved, and then simmered in a mixture of its own blood, wine, vinegar, and spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper. This created a dark, rich sauce that was considered extremely luxurious. The color of the sauce, a deep, reddish black, added to the dramatic presentation of the dish. When it is cooked, take it out and put it in cold water. Then take the blood and strain it through a cloth and put it in a pot with good wine and powder of spices. What made lamprey blood sauce particularly unusual was that medieval European cuisine generally avoided dishes featuring blood, except in specific preparations like blood sausages. The exception made for lampreys highlights just how prized these creatures were. Their strange, primitive biology, lampreys are among the oldest vertebrate species, having remained virtually unchanged for millions of years, may have contributed to the mystique surrounding them. Catching lampreys was itself a specialized skill, as they were typically harvested during their spring migration upriver to spawn. Special lamprey traps were constructed in suitable rivers, and the right to place these traps was a valuable privilege, often controlled by powerful monasteries or noble estates. This limited supply further enhanced their prestigious status. Number 1. Cockantrice's blood. The Bleeding Peacock. Would you gasp if your dinner came back to life before your eyes? What if your roast bird suddenly seemed to bleed when carved? Perhaps the most spectacular and bizarre dish served at medieval banquets was the redressed peacock, or cockentrice's blood. This extraordinary culinary presentation involves skinning a peacock carefully while keeping the skin and feathers intact, cooking the meat, and then sewing the bird back into its own skin to make it appear alive again at the dining table. The process of creating this show-stopping centerpiece was painstaking and required exceptional skill. First, the cook would carefully remove the peacock's skin without damaging the magnificent feathers. The skinning began at the neck, and special attention was paid to keeping the head and tail feathers attached to the skin. Once removed, the skin would be set aside, while the bare bird was roasted with spices and aromatic herbs. After the meat was cooked, the real magic began. The roasted peacock would be allowed to cool slightly before being sewn back into its own skin, creating the illusion of a live bird. The neck would be supported with wire to hold the head upright, and the tail feathers would be spread in their full glory. To enhance the theatrical effect, the bird was often embellished with gold leaf applied to the beak and claws, but the most dramatic and strange aspect of this dish was yet to come. Medieval recipes describe placing a small piece of cotton soaked in spirits, like brandy, in the bird's beak. Just before the peacock made its entrance to the dining hall, this cotton would be lit on fire, creating the surreal spectacle of a seemingly alive peacock breathing flames as it was carried to the table. Even more bizarrely, some variations of this dish included a special device to make the peacock bleed when carved. A small bladder filled with a mixture of red wine and spices would be concealed within the bird's chest cavity. When the carver made the first cut, this hidden reservoir would release its contents, producing a stream of blood that would flow onto the serving platter, shocking and delighting the assembled guests. The 15th century cookbook, Du Fait de Cuisine, by Master Chicart, chief cook to the Duke of Savoy, provides detailed instructions for this preparation, noting that the peacock should be presented as if alive and advising on the correct placement of the fire-breathing mechanism and the concealed bladder of blood. Peacocks themselves were incredibly expensive birds, not typically raised for food but kept as ornamental animals in the gardens of the wealthy. To slaughter one for a feast was already a significant display of wealth, but to transform it into this elaborate presentation was the ultimate statement of conspicuous consumption and theatrical dining. The symbolic value of the peacock added another dimension to this strange dish. In medieval Christian iconography, the peacock represented immortality and the resurrection, as it was believed that peacock flesh didn't decay after death. By presenting a cooked bird that appeared to come back to life and then bled when carved, the host created a dish with profound symbolic resonances that would have been immediately recognized by educated medieval diners. This theatrical presentation wasn't enjoyed by just anyone. It was reserved for the most important banquets and the highest status guests. Historical records show that redressed peacocks appeared at coronation feasts, royal weddings, and diplomatic banquets where impressing foreign dignitaries was particularly important. Ever wondered if people today would have the stomach for these medieval delicacies? Could our modern palates ever adapt to the strange combinations of meat, fruit, and blood that delighted our ancestors? What do these bizarre dishes reveal about how differently our ancestors viewed the relationship between food, entertainment, and status